Hello and welcome to the Locala Talking Sense sensory training package. Please watch every one of the first 4 videos which explain different types of sensory need and how to help. You may then choose to watch one of the follow-on videos which cover topics such as sleep, toileting needs and eating in meal times. This is part 1. Hi everybody and welcome to part 1 of Talking Sense. So in this unit we're going to talk about the following. What are the senses? What do we mean when we say sensory processing? We'll talk about different kinds of sensory needs and including the following. So what do we mean when we talk about under responding to sensation? What do we mean when we talk about over responding to sensation? We're also going to talk about sensory seeking behaviours and sensory avoiding behaviours and what we can do to help. So our senses are special organs and they tell us about what's happening inside our body and also what's happening in the world around us. And so during these presentations, we're going to be talking about the following senses. So our sense of touch, our sense of eyesight, the sense of hearing, our taste sense and our smell sense. And most people have heard of those 5 senses, but we're going to talk as well about some more unusual ones. So we're going to be introducing our body awareness sense, and that is sometimes called proprioception. We're going to be talking about our movement and balance sense, and that's sometimes called vestibular. And we're also going to be talking about a sense which tells us what's happening inside our body, and that is called interoception. So what is sensory processing? The term sensory processing describes how our brain gets information from our senses, and it's also how it uses this information to make sense of what's happening both in our bodies and in the world around us. So our senses, every minute of every day, send millions and millions of messages to the brain at any one time. And the brain has the job of sorting all these messages out, depending on it needs to make them a priority or it needs to ignore them, depending on how important they are. So sensory processing helps this process to run really smoothly, and it makes sure we get the messages that we need, but it stops us from getting bombarded with things that we don't need to know about, too much information. So this helps us know what's happening around us. It keeps us safe and it helps us to complete everyday activities. So to see how this works, we've got some examples of some messages that might be sent to the brain, and we can see how the messages in the first column are urgent, the messages in the middle column are useful, but maybe not something that we need to do something about immediately, and the messages in the third column are not really helpful. They're not things that we need to know, it's excess information. So this is looking at, again, some different examples in the different senses. So if we think about our sense of sight, if we're crossing the road and we see a car coming towards us at speed, that's a really urgent message. We need to do something about that straight away. If we're going to meet somebody somewhere and we're able to spot them in a crowd, that's really useful. If we couldn't do that, we'd really struggle to get on with our day. But if we're noticing tiny, tiny little visual details, little bits of fluff on the carpet, that's not really very important and we don't need to do that. So in the same way, we can see how urgent it is from our touch sense. If we notice really bad pain, we need to do something about it straight away. If we've got a pebble, say, in our shoe, we need to be able to feel it's there so we can get it out before it causes a blister or an injury. But if we're just feeling our clothes brushing against our arm, we don't really need to know that and it's not important. So you can see again, there's some examples with sound, with smell, and also from messages inside the body. So I'll let you have a look at those. When children have got sensory processing difficulties, the importance of these messages can get muddled. So children sometimes notice tiny little messages that are not important, but they fail to miss the really big important messages that they should be picking up on straight away. So this explains sometimes why children might say, not notice that they need to go to the toilet and have an accident, but they might notice tiny little visual details that are not really something that they need to get on with their day. So this diagram explains different ways that sensory needs can affect children. So if we see on the diagram here in the middle, we've got, this is the information from the senses which is coming into our brain. So we've got the touch, vision, sound, taste, smell, movement and body awareness. And it can affect children in 2 different ways. So either they can have difficulty getting the message, and that's when they tend to over or under respond to sensation or have a mixed response where they over respond to some things and under respond to others. But on this other side of the diagram, you can see that some people might get the message, but they really struggle to use it. And that's when you have difficulties with movement and sensory-based coordination difficulties. So the main sort of things that we tend to see for children who've got sensory-based coordination difficulties are things like poor posture and balance, again, just physical difficulty with everyday tasks, clumsiness, difficulty using both sides of the body, both hands together. And something else that we see quite a lot of as well is that children who have sensory-based movement difficulties quite often find it really hard to plan new things. So they might find it really hard to come up with a new movement idea or a new play idea, or if you're trying to get them to do a movement that they've not done before, they might find it really, really hard to work out how to do that just by watching somebody else. They might need to be physically moved through things. So what we find as well is that it's not always that children will fall on either this side or this side of the diagram. So some children will have difficulty both with getting the message and with using it as well. There are four main ways that children react to sensation. So the first way is under responding to sensation. So that means that they're not picking up on the sensory messages, even the ones that are really important. The second way is over responding, and that means they're picking up on everything. So nothing is being filtered out, they're noticing the tiny details and they're getting completely flooded by this. So whilst some children stay at either under or over responding to sensation, what we find is a lot of them actually try and find ways to make this work better for them. So children who don't get enough information, they do something called sensory seeking, and that's their way of trying to get the information that they need, and getting enough strong sensory messages so that their brain actually picks up on these and notices these. And the people who over respond to sensation tend to find ways in which they can avoid things that they find hard. So we're going to talk about those a little bit more in the next slide. So what tends to happen for children who under respond to sensation, we may see the following things. So sometimes they don't notice sensory messages at all, or sometimes they just take a really long time. So they do notice, but it takes them much, much longer to pick, and they pick up on things long after everybody else has noticed it. Some children only notice really, really strong sensations and don't notice just standard everyday messages. A lot of children who under respond can often seem quite zoned out and tired. They might seem to be a bit of a daydreamer, always sluggish, because again, they're just not getting the senses that they need to keep their system alert and active. A lot of children who under respond as well really struggle with transitioning from one environment to the next, because it takes them so much longer to notice everything and to work out where they are and what's happening, that by the time they've done that, if they're then quickly rushed on to something else, it's going to be really unsettling for them, because they feel like they're being rushed. They need time to settle and make sense of things before they get going again. And something else as well is that if children don't feel a lot of the things that they're doing, so if they under respond to everyday sensations, a lot of these things maybe aren't very meaningful for them. So the example on this slide, if you can't really taste what the chocolate is like, you're not really going to enjoy it if you can't recognize any of the taste and it doesn't taste nice to you. So in the same way, if you don't notice sort of fun and relaxing movements like going on a swing, that's not going to be something that's really going to be anything that you're going to be bothered about doing. So the sorts of behaviours that we're going to see from somebody who over responds to sensation. So these guys notice too much sensory information. They find it really hard to ignore the unhelpful sensory messages that are not needed. And because they're getting so many messages and things aren't being filtered out, they're just getting completely overwhelmed and overloaded with too much sensation. And quite often this can lead to anxiety. Sometimes children can seem to have a short fuse because they're just being so bombarded with all this sensation, and it's all too much. So put something else in the equation as well, and they really can't cope and they're going to have a meltdown. And what we might find as well is a lot of children who really over respond to sensation, if they're quite socially motivated and socially aware, they might mask these needs in the day. So when they're at school, they might be bothered by the feel of their uniform, the sound in the classroom, the smell of dinner cooking, but they try not to respond and react to it, and they save it all up, and they're a bit like a bottle of fizzy pop that's been shaken, and when they get home and they're in a safe place, like explode and have a meltdown as soon as they feel that it's safe for them to do so. So quite often children who really struggle to ignore unhelpful information and are very sensitive to all sorts of sensation adopt a strategy called sensory avoiding. And sensory avoiding is a way that they find their own ways to just limit how much sensation they're exposed to, particularly things that they find difficult. So for example, a sensory avoiding strategy might be if you're really sensitive to noise, you might either put your hands over your ears, you might make a lot of noise yourself, so that nobody else can know, so you can't hear what anybody else is saying. If you're sensitive to touch, then you might want to take off your clothes and just sit in your underwear, because it's your way of limiting difficult sensation that you find really hard to filter out, and sometimes it's the only way that you can stop it is by either removing yourself from the situation or removing whatever it is that's causing you difficulty. And quite unsurprisingly, children who are sensory avoiders really like to have very predictable routine. They quite often like to be in control, so they know exactly what sensation they're going to be faced with, and there aren't any unpleasant sensory surprises, because quite often if they've got to deal with something that they find difficult, it's really quite effortful for them, and so they really need to be primed and prepped for this so that they can psych themselves up and they're ready to tackle it. And something we find as well is a lot of children who are sensory avoiders, if they can't control the environment and if they are exposed to things that they find really hard, quite often they go into what's called a panic fight or flight response. And this can sometimes be quite significant. So on the other side of the coin, sensory seekers, they don't get the messages they need, so they're under responding to everyday levels of sensation. So what they're trying to do is finding ways to get sensory messages which are either stronger, happening more regularly, or more intense, because they can actually pick up on those. They're easy for them to notice. They notice stronger messages, but they don't notice just everyday levels of sensation. And quite often, children don't know that they're sensory seeking. It's almost like an inner drive, so they're really driven to get more sensory information, and it's something that they can't always help or they're not always aware of. So what sensory seeking does, it fills the gaps where there's information missing because the senses haven't picked up on it. And what the children actually are seeking and what it looks like is really going to vary depending on what sensory information they're missing in the first place. So say if somebody is under responding to touch, their way of sensory seeking might be that they need to pick everything up, they need to feel everything, and they can't just look at it, they need to be very hands-on with everything. But if you've got somebody who doesn't get enough information about how their body's moving, those guys might be really, really on the go and find it very, very difficult to sit still. So this brings us to one of the first key points in this presentation, and that is that most children have a mixed pattern. So they both under-respond to some sensations while over-responding to others. So what we find is maybe somebody might over-respond to sound and be really sensitive to noise, but they under-respond to touch, and so they need to feel everything. And this again is why a lot of children who've got any sensory processing difficulties might seem different, because it really depends on their pattern of what they under-respond to and what they over-respond to. And as everybody's is a little bit different, this is why you can have two children who've got sensory processing needs who are completely opposite. It really depends on what it is that they're not noticing and what they're noticing too much of. So the last point we'd like to think about in this first presentation is just not to forget, absolutely everybody has got some sensory quirks and sensory differences, but we don't need to worry about them unless they're actually interfering with what we need to do in our everyday lives. So this slide just demonstrates the difference between everyday sensory seeking behaviours that a lot of people do and don't think about it, and these things aren't a problem. They just maybe help us to keep a little bit more alert or a little bit more focused. And then also sensory behaviours where we maybe would worry a little bit more about it and we might need to do something and seek some support to manage these ones. So on the left, these are the ones that pretty much everybody does at some point or another. So things like tapping your pencil, tapping your feet, twirling your hair, fiddling with your clothes, your jewellery. You might need to have the radio on or have some sound on all the time, not like it quiet. You might chew and bite on your nails, you might chew chewing gum. None of these things are things that I would worry about at all. Some people might need to shake their leg while they're sitting. Where if on the other hand we just contrast that with things, once people start, they're not twirling their hair, but they're actually pulling it really hard, and then even needing a really extreme level of sensation with that, that's something that I would worry a bit more about. Same, if people start doing things like really kicking out, needing to really rip things apart, pull their clothing apart, they're actually hurting themselves with some of the behaviours they're doing, like sticking a pencil into their leg, that sort of thing. Or they need things to be really, really loud, so it's at max volume and you're worried that it's going to hurt their ears. They're biting their hand rather than just chewing their nails. They may be screaming, getting distressed, or chewing holes in their clothing. So this is just to demonstrate, all of these things I would be much more concerned about, and this is where I think you will need to seek some support or to use some of the strategies that we're going to talk about. Whereas the things on the left, everyday things, everybody does them, it's not anything to worry about. So just like to finish this section with a book recommendation for some further reading. And the first book that we're going to recommend is a book called Can I Tell You About Sensory Processing Difficulties? And that's written by somebody called Sue Allen. This is the end of Talking Sense Part 1. When you feel ready, please move to Talking Sense Part 2. Thank you.